Hi, Josh.
How are you, Bob?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Good.
It's a pleasure being on your show.
You are Josh Landis. You're in Oklahoma, state of my birth, by the way. I was born in Lawton. How many people do you know who can say that? Well, you know more than most Americans
Well, that's
know.
the artillery range. Your father must have been doing something military.
He was a lifer. My family was a military family. He was with the artillery in World War II, and he stuck with it as a career. You're right. I was born at Fort Sill in Lawton. And military affairs will, in some sense, enter the conversation we're about to have. I should say you are one of America's foremost experts on Syria. You're a professor at the University of Oklahoma there. You're head of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And we are going to talk about something that if you had told me a year ago was even a subject to talk about, I would have been surprised. If you had told me that there was a kind of a brewing crisis involving the following countries: Ukraine, Russia, Sweden, Finland, Turkey, Syria, I would not have known what you meant. But in fact, that's the case. And I think a lot of people aren't really familiar with the Turkey-Syria part of this and the possibility that, as I guess in some ways, as a byproduct of the war in Ukraine, you could wind up with Turkey invading Syria or something. Anyway, if I'm wrong about that, you can straighten me out. I want to, before we get to the immediate situation, I'd like to back up and set the stage by just kind of reminding people of, recent Syrian history, the war there, which of course did involve Russia and in a different way, the United States and US allies. But first I want to back up even further than that. I didn't know until reading your Wikipedia entry, Josh, that you were in Syria, as I understand it, when a famously brutal repression perpetrated by the father of the current Syrian president, the previous Assad,
the Hama uprising
in Hama. Right, you were in Syria, and then you went and visited Hama shortly after this. I mean, I gather that thousands of people were killed by Syrian troops, and hundreds, or 1,000 or something, of the troops died. But this is a famously brutal thing, and some would see it as a kind of a harbinger of what happened under his son. You want to talk a little about that?
Yes, it was a prelude. It's a good way to step into the Syrian problem, because Syria is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious land. The whole Ottoman Empire was multi-ethnic, multi-religious. And, in a way to think about this, in connecting Ukraine and everything, is that Central Europe and Ottoman Empire, there are four great empires. And the First World War was the empire-destroying war. It really proved how much more efficient nation states were at mobilizing the population, getting money, and putting up a standing army that was loyal to the state, that would go out and die for the state. The empires, mutinies, people left the military, not that kind of national loyalty. And so we have the Austro-Hungarian, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, for our purposes, all collapse. And out of it comes a string of new nation states. There are 9 in Europe. There's a whole bunch in the Middle East that are new nation states with new borders. And now the Russian Empire re-emerges in red clothing after World War I. And it's still lingering in a sense today. And that's part of the reason why its military is so, overestimated. But out of the Ottoman Empire get built all of these little, theoretically, nation states, but they're really just chunks of this multi-ethnic empire. And there's going to turn them into nation states is a very bloody process. And we saw that bloody process in Central Europe, where countries like Poland, only 64% Polish before World War II, by 1950, 100% Polish. All the Jews, 3 million killed. The Germans, ethnically cleansed from Poland. The Ukrainians driven out. This happens in Czechoslovakia. It happens right down Central Europe. About 42 million people are ethnically cleansed at the end of World War II and during the late 50s. We always think of World War II ending in 45, but in fact, in Central Europe, it continues because there's this tremendous ethnic cleansing going on right from one end of Central Europe to the other in order to build these nation states. And little places like Czechoslovakia can't even hold together. They have to have their Velvet Revolution. The Czechs and Slovaks separate. We saw what happened in Yugoslavia. But that's what's happening in the Levant states, in the Middle Eastern states today, is that we're seeing this brutal civil war, which is about who's going to control and what's the identity of the nation state.
What's the ethnic
There's
identity?
ethnic cleansing going on. And America stepped into the middle of this. With the Arab Spring, really, in Syria, was about reform because there had been this terrible dictatorship. The Assad family ruled Syria from 1970, when Hafez al-Assad, the father, took over in a military coup, until today. And now the son took over in 2000 when the father died, and he's ruled up until today. But the Assad family belongs to the Alawite religious community. It's a heterodox Shiite spin-off, but it's only about 12% of the country, and they've grabbed
and Josh, can I just interrupt and this just occurred to me, just to make sure people understand how pervasive the phenomenon you're discussing is, which is to say, what happens when national borders don't correspond to ethnic borders? And of course, the way the European powers and the U.S. managed the aftermath of World War I created a lot of that in the Middle East. We just drew straight lines, whatever their corresponds to tribal lines. But what I wanted to add was, remember, this is kind of the way World War II started. Hitler didn't like the fact that there were German-speaking people that weren't in Germany, and he said, "Well, let's just expand Germany, wherever that is the case."
The bigger Germany solution, because there are 12 million Germans who are outside of the borders. For example, little Ukraine, which we talk about today so much, little Ukraine had 6% German population. Hitler conquers it to try to bring it into this big Germany. He uses the German minority as a collaborative elite to rule a place. Then as soon as Stalin takes it back, those German elite gets wiped out. Many of them get killed or marched off to Siberia, but others flee back towards Germany. And all 12 million of those Germans living in places like the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia and in Poland and so forth are ethnically cleansed at the end of World War II and have to fall back on the motherland or get killed. And that process is a process of sort of what I call the great sorting out.
And just one more quick interjection. This is one reason people are comparing Putin to Hitler. The context of the war in Ukraine is him saying, "Wait a second, there are these ethnic Russians across the border in Ukraine, and," he said, "they are being persecuted." A charge that's not totally devoid of accuracy. There has been at least some persecution, and we can argue about, and I certainly don't support invading countries in situations like this. And he violated international law, and he's in the wrong, and so on. But again, it's generically kind of the same problem that we have trouble managing.
It's a messy ethnic and religious problem, and this is. Russia's big and it can throw its weight around. Of course, Russia conquered Ukraine back in the 18th century, Catherine the Great and so forth, and has been mixed up with Ukraine. Claims that Ukraine is sort of the proto-Russian, the Rus and so forth, which we've largely debunked. But these different national identities emerge, and they're still split in a place like Ukraine, and they're going to get sorted out, and that's what this war is doing. And it's going to be very bloody because of it.
And you don't see, does that mean that in the case of Ukraine, believe me, I'll let you get back to your narrative, which is fascinating in itself, but does that mean that you suspect that in Ukraine, ultimately, look, the Donbass is going to wind up either under Russian control in some sense? That's where the ethnic Russians are.
If it does, the Ukrainians, the people who want to be Ukrainians in that area are going to have to flee and go.
Well, many of them have already.
Yes, they have. And if Ukraine is going to reconquer it, those Russians are going to get scalped, or they're going to flee back into Russia, and it's going to sort this area out around these national loyalties, and that's where the tussle is really coming. Now, in Crimea, had been ruled by Crimean Tartars. Those Tartars were wiped out in World War II by Stalin. The Russians, since Catherine the Great, had populated the area, and it was 87% ethnic Russian. So Ukraine is much harder to make this argument that, not Ukraine, excuse me, Crimea is harder to make the argument that it shouldn't be Russian.
Right.
But obviously, this is, these wars are messy, and it's about identity. And we know in Ukraine, you've got families that are split down the middle, where one identifies with the Ukrainian side and the other part of the family identifies with the Russian side. And it's very hard to because it's not really ethnic. It's a cultural war about identity and where your history is and your past and how
it's not racial. It's
put it that way. Yes.
So sorry. So I took you away from the Middle East just to make sure people understand some of the parallels, and there are more we'll get to, I think. But go ahead and resume wherever you feel.
The point I'm trying to make is that Syria has been ruled with a security state that is packed with Alawite officers. Now, the Alawite officers, who are the Alawites are 12%, have allied themselves with other minorities, like the Christians, another 8% or something like that, 4 to 8% today. They used to be 15, but with Druze and Ismailis, other religious minorities, in order to cling on to power. They've also allied themselves with many Sunnis, particularly upper class Sunnis who have a lot to lose in a war. So this country was split along these religious and ethnic lines. And we see the Kurds in the north, 10% of the population, who would like to have their own, independent nation, if not autonomy. Perhaps autonomy is what they're going for today. But there's a desire to have what they call their national rights. And this is splitting apart Syria. The regime is trying to keep control of everything. And the Sunni Arab population, which didn't all, but much of it joined the rebel cause. And within a year of the uprising, almost all the rebels were Sunni Arabs. And the Kurds were doing their own thing, but the Sunni Arabs and America began to support them.
When did America begin to support the Sunnis?
Well, America began to support them from day one in rhetorical terms.
So this is like what year?
This is 2011, March 2011, the uprising begins. And the United States and the ambassador who was there, Ford, ultimately went to Hama, joined the protesters, and spoke out very forcefully in favor of freedom, democracy, and so forth. And America very early pitched this uprising as an uprising about democracy, in the same way they had done in Iraq and were doing in Libya and so forth, Afghanistan.
And there was some of that spirit, right? I mean, I remember, as I recall, one big thing was like these junior high kids or something put some slogans on a building. I don't know if it said Assad must fall or what. And so maybe it wasn't kind of like a liberal democracy slogans per se, but I mean, they wanted self-determination. You tell me, sorry. Anyway, those kids, I gather, were like put in jail and treated pretty brutally for kids, right?
Yes, they were tortured. Everybody in Syria wanted reform, and everybody in Syria had been chafing at the security state, which had become corrupt and treated people miserably. So the Alawites, the minorities, everybody wanted a change and wanted some. But the trouble is, they didn't agree. Some people wanted an Islamic type state with more Sharia law. Other people wanted a secular state, particularly the minorities, upper class Sunnis. So people had not come to grips with what is Syria. How do we define? Most people defined it as Arab nationalism, but others as Syrian nationalism. There wasn't even any agreement over what the true national identity, because the Kurds are not included in the Arab nationalism, but they are in a Syrian national identity, and so forth and so on. So it was a mess. And America framed it as a democratic revolution. The revolutionaries themselves did not frame it that way in the beginning. The slogans were about freedom, a change of system, isqat al-nizam, down with the regime, and Assad's got to go, and dignity. So freedom and dignity were the words that were used. And they were very carefully chosen, because the organizers that were on Facebook and Twitter and so forth outside of Syria, and there were many expats who had been kicked out by the Assad regime and had been thrown out in '82 when he destroyed the Muslim Brotherhood. They were very careful to try to frame these and encouraged all Syrians not to use sectarian religious slogans or Islamic slogans. Mm-hmm. But they didn't want to say liberal democracy, because a lot of Syrians don't know what liberal democracy is, and they don't like the word liberal and secular, because they want something Muslim. And all the militias that sprung up to fight Assad wanted more Sharia law. That was the one thing that they had in common. So using the word democracy was going to split the opposition. And so the organizers did not want to use that. Later it comes out, because America's forcing people to put it in there, because they're not going to get money unless they say they're going to treat everybody equally and there's going to be democracy and free elections and so forth.
So the Syrian Democratic Forces, I think, is the name of the group that we came to support. Is that right? Or is that
only after the rise of ISIS? The Syrian Democratic Forces are in the northeast, where the Kurds predominate. And when we switched in 2016, we switched horses. We stopped supporting the Arab fighters, and because they wouldn't fight against ISIS.
The Sunni Arabs would not fight.
Arab fighters.
The Shia Arabs would have been happy to fight against ISIS.
Yes,
but there weren't many.
Did. They were part, and they were
in Lebanon, for example.
Regime. They were loyalists.
Right.
All the different heterodox religious groups and Shiites and Christians were by and large loyal. Not all, but most remained loyal to Assad, because they feared an Islamic, some kind of Islamic state being created that would discriminate against them. So once Al-Qaeda and ISIS became the paramount powers in Syria, overshadowing the many militias that made up the Free Syrian Army that America was trying to support, that were not so Islamist, then America got spooked. And we remember that already by the end of 2014, ISIS had become a real power. It swept through Iraq, but it started in Syria, in Raqqa in the northeast, and it carved out a big hunk of Syria. It owned about 40% of the Syrian territory, and it was moving towards Damascus. And America began to be very anxious that ISIS and Al-Qaeda would take Damascus if Assad fell. And John Brennan, head of CIA, gives a long interview at the Council on Foreign Relations in 2015, March 2015, and he says, we don't want Assad to fall, the regime to fall, and the military to fall, because the ISIS and Al-Qaeda are most likely to take over. And now Russia was listening to that. And it's shortly after that Russia makes the decision to come in on the side of Assad. And I think Russia made the calculation, well-founded, that America would not object. And in fact, John Kerry and others immediately began to cooperate with the Russians on how to stabilize Syria. And there was a division of labor. America was going to take on ISIS, and Russia was going to stabilize the Assad regime and take on all the other militias that were in Syria. So America stuck to the northeast, killing ISIS, and to do that, they dumped the Arab militias and they started supporting the Kurds, because the Kurds are in the northeastern region and they had been clobbered by ISIS, who were depending on the Arab tribes of the region to be their manpower. And the Arabs, this turned it into an Arab versus Kurdish and some of the Christians in the area hostility, an ethnic battleground.
Okay, so to make sure I understand, so we initially, Obama kind of wandered into the Syrian thing, I might say.
He got pushed in. He did not want to get involved.
What, by American hawks or something? I mean, and at some point he makes this statement, Assad must go. Well, that's a big commitment. But, at that point, it made sense to, if you're going to go with that commitment, makes sense to support the Sunnis who want to overthrow Assad. But then once ISIS is the big threat in Syria, the Sunnis we were supporting don't want to fight ISIS. We want somebody to fight ISIS. It's a little awkward at that point to say, well, okay, we're pro-Assad after all. Although most of the natural enemies of ISIS are on Assad's side. That's our problem suddenly. The Kurds are at that point the one group, right, that is willing to fight ISIS and is not on Assad's side. So we basically ally with them and have an understanding, in effect, with Russia that they can do what it's too awkward for us to do, right? Which is turn on our erstwhile allies, these Sunnis. That's all.
Militias. Yes, absolutely. And, we, in a sense, ignited Kurdish nationalism in order to gain. I mean,
it existed. We didn't create it. It was a force, but we gave them hope. We gave
them hope, and we armed them. And we said we're not going to start a Kurdish nation. Okay, from the very beginning, we made it clear that we're not going to support an independent Kurdish nation, but we're going to give you arms, we're going to train you, and we don't like Assad, and so forth. So, in that sense, the Kurds said, okay, we're happy to say we're going to remain in Syria under an autonomous situation, but we will take your arms and we will take your air power and we will fight ISIS in order to regain control of all this territory north of the Euphrates River, which is a lot of territory, much more than the Kurds, are the majority population in. So they got a very good deal short term. The problem is, now that ISIS is largely destroyed, will America stay? Because without America, the Kurds are finished as an independent power in the region because they don't have an air force. There are 2 million plus Kurds in Syria. They were the poorest population before the war. To try to create an independent state out of them is a Herculean task that America is not going to take on. But worse than that, for the Kurds, is that Turkey sees that YPG, which is the major Kurdish military organization.
Now, they associated with the KPP is the Turkish separatist group that Erdogan considers the enemy. Is the YPG their military arm or what?
Okay. The PKK, which
it's the PKK. I had it wrong.
PKK. It's the Kurdish Workers' Party.
Okay.
In Turkish, the acronym is PKK. PKK.
Okay.
And that has been fighting under Öcalan, their leader, for an autonomous region and Kurdish nationalism in eastern Anatolia. So if they were to win under Öcalan, they would hive off a big hunk of Turkey. So Turkey's not going to let this. There's been a low-grade war there. Turkey's been slamming them. 40,000 people plus have been killed over the last 30, 40 years. So it's a very serious matter in Turkey. The YPG in Syria is a wing of the PKK. It's got an independent leadership. They have distanced themselves to a certain degree from the PKK. America has said they're not the PKK and in order to arm them, because America recognizes the PKK as a terrorist group and works with Turkey to suppress them. But America needed their organization and allies in Syria. So it declared them a different power and encouraged the leadership of the YPG to distance themselves. But they still have big signs of Öcalan, and the distance is a little bit fluid. So Turkey says these are all terrorists. America's supporting terrorists, and America's done a terrible thing in Syria by arming these people, because the arms are going to seep across the border, the loyalties are still there, and this is going to put a fire underneath this rebellion in eastern Anatolia. So so Turkey is at loggerheads with the United States, and that's how the whole Sweden-Finland thing comes in.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask about.
Lots of Kurds and lots of Turks have gone and migrated over the last 40, 50 years to Sweden, particularly Sweden, and Finland, but mostly Sweden. And Sweden has been very liberal in taking in Arab refugees, Syrian refugees, but also all these Kurds. And it allows the PKK and various Kurdish political parties to, in a sense, have a soapbox in Sweden. So Turkey sees Sweden wanting to join NATO and has veto power over this and is saying, no, you cannot join until you crack down on this terrorist organization. Okay. And we have to agree that this is a terrorist organization. You're going to crack down on it, and you're not going to enter until you do. And this is a way for Turkey to make America take seriously its demands to back off supporting the YPG in Syria as well. And so Erdogan is threatening to invade northern Syria and to push the YPG 30 kilometers away from the border. Turkey says we want a buffer zone along the entire 500-mile Syrian border. And
now, did they create some part of that during the Trump administration?
Yes, they did.
With Trump's acquiescence.
Trump agreed to it. Turkey jumped in, and then Trump reversed. So Turkey got some hunks of it, but he was kept out of other places, particularly the places that have a heavy Kurdish population. But the Kurds are on tenterhooks. They are biting their nails, worried that Washington will sacrifice them in order to gain Turkish support in Ukraine.
So Erdogan wants Washington to say, if you will let Finland and Sweden into NATO, we will let you engage in basically ethnic cleansing. Is that a fair term? South of the Turkish border?
That's what's been happening in Afrin, in areas west where American troops are not. American troops are in eastern North Syria, but in west North Syria, there are important pockets of Kurdish population. And in Afrin, a big one, the Turks moved their military and their proxies, their Arab rebel proxies that they support, into this area and drove out 200,000 Kurds from Afrin and arrested many others who had disappeared and so forth, and moved in Arab refugees. Now the Turks say, look, all we're doing is getting rid of a terrorist. We're not against Kurds. We're against a terrorist organization. And we're repatriating all these Syrians who are going back, the Syrian Arab Sunnis who've been driven up into Turkey. There's over 3 million in Turkey. We're going to bring them back to Syria, build them housing, put electricity in. We're a charity organization. And this is just bringing Syrians back to Syria. We're not engaged in ethnic cleansing.
And we'd like the Kurds to move, and we'd like the Kurds to move to create the space to put the
where the YPG in particular, that's what they're saying. But all the Kurds are fleeing because it's very hard to tell who's who, and all the Kurds largely support the YPG, who they see as their protector, and they're frightened of the Turks.
So this would be both an invasion of Syria, a violation of international law in that sense, which Turkey has already done with Trump's acquiescence, temporary acquiescence. And then on top of that, it would be, a kind of ethnic cleansing, I guess. And I mean, is there? Do you think there's a chance that they'll prevail and the U.S. will say, okay, we really want Sweden and Finland in NATO, and if this is your price, we'll pay it?
It leaves America in a very unenviable position because it is allied itself with the Kurds. The Kurds, thousands of Kurds were killed fighting ISIS. They have been our most loyal ally. They've been a loyal ally in Iraq. So for us to pull out of Syria will mean that there's a land rush. The Syrian army, supported by the Russians, will try to move up from the south and say, this is Syria, we're a sovereign nation, they should be under our control. Turkey is going to rush in from the north and say these are all terrorist organizations and we got to clean them out of this area because the Syrian army it won't do it. So America doesn't need to be in North Syria today. It's there in order to fight ISIS, but ISIS is a rearguard action. And in fact, America's presence, one can argue, is only helping ISIS today.
In what way? Because
Syria is divided into three major zones. There's a Syrian zone under which Assad rules about 70%, 65, 70% of the country. There's an American zone in the northeast, dominated by the Kurds, that owns about 25% of the country. And there's a Turkish zone in the northwest, which is about 6, 7, 8% of the country. So those three zones are all enemies, one of the other. Arab Sunni rebels, Kurdish, pro-American, Assad, pro-Iran, pro-Russia. And because they're all enemies of each other, and ISIS is only a distant number two enemy to any one of those today, because they're all worried about somebody else. ISIS can play in between, can run in between the legs of these three inimical powers. And there's no joint police force, there's no sharing of intelligence, there's no working together. And so ISIS benefits from that, the chaos in this border regions where it's going back and forth. And that's why we're finding the head of, the last two caliphs of ISIS have been caught in the Turkish-dominated zone, which has Arab rebels in it. And they're very Islamist, and they tend to close their eyes to these Islamists.
And how would that change if we were not such a presence in Syria? So if we weren't so supportive of the Kurds, is that the idea?
Well, what's going to happen, I would posit, here I'm going out on a limb, but what I believe will happen is that the United States, not under Biden, because Biden pulled out of Afghanistan and took a big hit. He's not going to pull out of Syria and take a second big hit on foreign policy. He'll stay there and kick the can down the road. But the next administration, or the administration after that, within 10 years, America is going to leave Syria. And that means abandoning this top-heavy Kurdish administered 25% of Syria. And that'll be like leaving Afghanistan, because they will be enemies of those Kurds who are going to take over. And it can either be the Assad and his army, or it can be the Turks and their army. Now, the Kurds
will have to fight somebody when we leave. Is that the idea?
Yes, they're going to have to just choose one side or the other. And the side they will choose is Assad, because Assad needs the Kurds in order to rule northeast Syria. And he wants to go back to his borders. Now, the Kurds want full autonomy, have their own military, and their own schools, and speak Kurdish. Assad is not going to let them do that. And he won't agree to that kind of autonomy. He says, no, all the Kurds must serve in the Syrian army, and it'll be the Syrian army that rules this area. So he'll put paid to any kind of quasi-independence or self-determination. He might give them, and he's already said you can have Kurdish in your schools, some kind of cultural autonomy. But the Kurds, that would be better for the Kurds than what Turkey is offering, because Turkey is going to push them out of that border region and put Arab rebel groups in their place, which would be much worse for them. So they've been carrying out talks with Assad, even as America has ruled the place. Assad won't give them what they want. As long as America is willing to stay, the Kurds will stick with the Americans. But the moment that America says we're leaving, the Kurds are going to have to scramble and come up with some kind of alliance with Assad. It would behoove the United States not to repeat its Afghan experience, which is to sort of make the decision, we're pulling out our troops, without preparing for some kind of transition. And that's going to be a painful transition, but it's one that America should be carrying out.
What would its general contours be? I mean, how?
The contours would be that the Syrian army is going to rule northeastern Syria. And that means the leadership that we have built up there under the YPG and the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is what we named them, which is largely dominated by Kurds, but not entirely Kurdish. There are Christian Assyrians, there's tribal Sunnis. There is a mixture, but the leadership is Kurdish. That leadership will probably flee, like the Afghan government. They're not going to want to stay because they've been traitors, right? They have worked with America. They've taken the oil outside of the country. They've enriched themselves, trying to build an autonomous region. Now, it's, you can, if you're sympathetic to the Kurds, you're saying they're just doing what's natural for them. But the trouble is, from the eyes of the Arab Syrians, they're traitors because they're working with a foreign power, America, to take away Syrian oil, which is largely in their region, some of the best agricultural land and water rights. So, and they're working with the Americans. So they're going to be seen, so that leadership is going to have to run away. And they're going to have to apply for American citizenship.
But you're saying if we do the alternative and support Turkey, things are even worse for the Kurds on balance.
They're going to get killed. They're going to all have to flee too, but there's going to be much more popular destabilization.
Not to mention the fact that you will suddenly have to redraw borders, which is inherently a messy business, right? I mean, if Turkey...
inherently a messy business.
I mean, maybe you wouldn't have to, but that seems like a
Turkey
likely
would rule it the way they're ruling North Syria, is that they would have Arab proxies.
Yeah.
They would claim that this is the legitimate Arab Syria because Assad is illegitimate. And they would use their proxies to rule it in the same way that America is using the Kurds to rule that area today. So there's all ways to skin the cat in this sovereignty issue. But, the UN recognizes the Assad government. And America, this is one of America's big problems in the Northeast and why we couldn't exploit the oil that's there, because it's Syria's oil. If we export it through an American company, we're stealing their oil in the same way that we're accusing Russia of stealing Ukraine's wheat by shipping it out of Ukraine. And they say, no, that's not Russian wheat and that's not Donbass wheat, that's Ukrainian wheat and you can't ship it out. But we're doing the same thing in Syria.
Right.
And so, yeah.
We should just, pause and note that, there's been every once in a while, American politicians talk about international law and bemoan the violation of it. But we are, in fact, in violation of international law just in having troops in Syria that the Syrian government doesn't want there. Is that, I'm not neither of us, I suppose, is a scholar of international law, but that would seem to be the straightforward reading of the situation.
The big difference between us in Syria and the United States and Ukraine is that we're supporting an insurgency to overthrow the internationally recognized government.
You mean between us and Syria and Russia and Ukraine, right? That's the difference you're drawing. Okay.
Because in Syria, Russia was on the side of the recognized government.
Right.
It was invited by the recognized government to help them. Now,
so they were not violating international law in Syria. It is, I've seen people list that as a Russian invasion, but that's really not what it was under international law.
No, the Americans were the invaders in Syria because we moved our troops in to support insurgents who've taken a hunk of Syrian territory. Now, of course, America says these are freedom fighters against a tyrannical, brutal regime. And there's, that...
Which is what Russia says about Donbass. But anyway.
Saying about trying to use the same language of the Nazi regime and so forth. So it is, but in terms of international law, yes. Okay,
so just to crystallize the situation with Turkey, Sweden, Finland, and NATO. Turkey is saying what they want is for Finland and Sweden to quit supporting Kurds, rebellious Kurds from Turkey's point of view, who have moved to Finland and Sweden and are operating out of there. And I'm sure Turkey would like that, but there's something else they're hoping to get out of this moment, which is to solve what they consider the problem in northern Syria with the Kurds, which would involve, in effect, a kind of invasion, a forcible relocation of some Kurds, the movement into Syria of refugees who also are by and large enemies of the Assad regime, I guess. And so I guess one question is, would Turkey kind of settle for either of those, do you think, in exchange for letting Sweden and Finland into NATO? I'm sure they'd love to have both, right? Solve both
like
problems. But they're only citing one as their official grievance. And presumably...
that's not completely true, because
Erdogan
is talking about invading Syria.
He's talking about it.
We're going to go in there and we're going to build this buffer zone, and we're going to take out the YPG. Now, the problem with that is that in Syria, there's a long border, and the eastern part of Syria, America is protecting the Kurds. In the western part of Syria, the Aleppo province, just north of Aleppo, the Kurds are protected by Russia and the Syrian army. So it's beautiful from Erdogan's point of view, because he's playing down the middle on Ukraine. He's giving support to the Ukrainian government, but he's also not sanctioning Russia. He's taking Russian oil. He's got Russian trade. He's allowed a Russian, oligarchs to park their yachts on the Turkish coast. So he's playing this delicate balance in between Russia and the United States. And that balance is reflected in Syria. So he could attack the Kurds on the Russian side, or he could attack the Kurds on the American side. Now, obviously, he's seeing Russia in a very weak position. And he might be able to make a deal with the Russians to attack the Kurds on the Russian side of Syria, which would hurt Assad in Russia, but do it in order to keep Turkey sweet with Putin. I mean, if Putin let him do it, he could negotiate and say, don't give any more of those drones. Don't, allow our ships to go through, allow, us to send oil through Turkey. All of those sorts of things could be negotiated. But then he can turn around to the Americans and say, look, Russia's giving me a good deal, and you're giving me nothing. So I'm not, you got to give me something on the Kurdish side of things. And he can play those two against each other. And so he's in a very enviable position of leverage here. And he's trying to maximize it by threatening to invade, not allow Sweden and Finland into NATO, and to just make a big ruckus about how he's badly treated, and America's supporting, and the Europeans are supporting this terrorist organization, the Kurds, the Kurdish PKK.
Do you think the dealing is actually going on? In other words, there are conversations between Turkey and Russia, and between Turkey and the U.S.
Yes.
Kind of like about what will you let me do in Syria?
Yes. How do we come to an agreement? That's the way they're being probably phrased, is how do we find some, we have legitimate defense concerns. In America, that's America's language. America always starts out any response to Erdogan by saying you have legitimate security concerns on your border with the YPG. Then they say, but you can't take anything. Mm-hmm. So then they're going to say, well, if they're legitimate, why you've got to let us have this buffer zone. And so it becomes very awkward, and America doesn't want them to do anything. On the other hand, Turkey is much more important to the United States than these Kurds in Syria. And that's the terrible problem for the Kurds in Syria. The balance of power today, now that ISIS is destroyed, largely, is that Turkey is just so much more important. Turkey is the seventh largest economy in Europe. It's one of the 17th in the world or something like that. It's a major power, and it sits in between all these continents. It's important to Russia. So Turkey is sitting there in a very enviable position. It's got a lot of leverage, and America's honor is at line, supporting the Kurds, but not much else.
So you think ultimately America will get out of Syria, withdraw the troops?
Oh, yes. We're not going to stay there for 100 years.
Yeah,
but have an air force.
But it kind of depends. You can imagine
that air power off of them. They're finished as an independent military force.
But you can imagine a series of presidents of America who would all find it too awkward to withdraw or just ideologize. I mean, look, if
Sure.
if you just look at recent candidates,
it's inexpensive.
Yeah.
It's inexpensive. They're going to kick the can down the road. But eventually, like in Afghanistan, somebody's going to come along and say, what the hell are we doing here? And Trump tried to do that, right? And a lot of Americans were sympathetic to it. Mm-hmm. It's like, why do we need 2,000 troops in Syria? What are they doing? And we're getting into all these fights. Now, so far, Americans have not been killed in Syria.
Right. That's a difference.
But there are a lot of people who are looking for ways to kill those Americans. And Turkey will find a way, the Syrian government, Iran, so forth, all of whom ISIS is trying to kill Americans there. They're all going to work to, and a lot of the Arabs in that American zone feel unhappy because the Kurds are ruling the roost. So there's that ethnic trouble, and Assad and others can play on that ethnic trouble. So there's a lot of ways to begin to pull the lion's tail in this area, and we'll get stuck the way we were in Iraq. You send rockets or drones to attack American bases, and then it becomes, why are we here?
Yeah. Now, one answer would be, well, we get to steal the oil. I mean, how literally, I mean, what do we do with the oil? Are we just taking the oil? How does the oil leave Syria? Whose hands is it in? Who profits immediately? Like, are these American oil companies? What happens with the oil in the land that we occupy?
American oil companies now in Syria, because Trump did give a license to an American oil company.
Yeah.
American built oil company to go in and there was a contract for about $2 billion to rehabilitate the Syrian oil wells, largely destroyed, and all the infrastructure is just a mishmash. There's oil leaking out in the desert. It's a mess. And somebody needs to reorganize it, because that's the wealth that could rebuild northeastern Syria. So, but because it's all illegal for America to be taking out Syrian oil against the international government, recognized government, America decided, Biden said, no, we're not going to do that. He took away the license from that company. And today, the Kurds are bringing out crude oil. Many Kurds are trying to smuggle it to Damascus because that's where the refineries are and it's easiest, and Syria needs oil. But America's trying to discourage them from doing that. Say, don't do that because that'll help Assad. We want to starve Assad. Let's get it out through Iraq. And so they're taking it out in tankers and so forth into Iraq, and it's being sold through Iraq. But that means the Iraqis get a lot of the money for facilitating this, and there's very little money is trickling back to the Kurdish-dominated authority of this autonomous zone, and that's where the money is going. But it's dribs and drabs of money compared to what it could be if the wells were really cleaned out and pipelines were put in there and so forth.
Okay. In retrospect, the whole U.S. intervention in Syria, and after this, I want to get back to Russia a little, but, what would you say about that? My sense has been that if we had just, well, if you imagined a scenario, and this is pure thought experiment, because I don't know that we could have controlled what our regional allies did, even if we had tried to exert pressure. But if you imagine a world in which us and our regional allies are not pouring weapons into Syria, presumably what you wind up with is kind of what you have now. Assad is still the leader of Syria, except with a lot fewer dead people, a lot fewer refugees. And Syria is, in fact, still a coherent country, and its various parts aren't occupied by various countries. Is that
yes?
Is that your take?
The dilemma is that you leave the Assad government in power,
which it is anyway.
Which it is in 70% of the country, but not in the other 30%. And
yeah, but it ain't leaving, right? I mean, we've given up on that. I assume maybe we haven't.
Right, but Turkey is supporting this big.
Right.
That's the trouble. Is Turkey has supported the Arab rebel militias that have been pushed back by the Assad military into this northwestern zone. Into the northeastern zone are the Kurds, which America has supported and built up and developed a lot of loyalties with. So those leaderships are going to be pummeled if Assad takes over. And there's going to be an outflow of refugees again, the way there was in Afghanistan when America left. And a lot of people who we've spent a lot of time telling, trust us, be loyal, work with us. We're going to build democracy and secular regime and so forth. Those people are going to be, they're going to, from our zone, it's going to be Kurds, and from the other zone, it's going to be the more Islamist fighters, the rebel fighters, who Turkey has largely taken under their wing today. So that's the trouble. And in the Northwest, the Turkish side, there are at least 3 million refugees that got driven out in front of the Assad's army that are sitting there in refugee camps. And if Assad takes over, many of those people fought against his regime tooth and nail, are considered traitors, and they're going to try to flee into Turkey. So Turkey doesn't want that. That's the humanitarian dilemma here. And that's why Syria remains divided into three today, because the international community doesn't know what to do. And they don't want to be responsible for the humanitarian, terrible situation that's going to ensue if Assad takes over both of these regions. So in a sense, they've come to this division of Syria has been legitimized in the eyes of the international community. And how it's going to undo itself is unclear, because the Northwest, the Turkish zone, is really like the Gaza Strip in some ways. It is very poor, tons of refugee camps, with no people not being able to get in and out with ease, because Turkey's built a big wall and Syria has got this front line. And so they're trapped in there with very little money, being fed by international largesse. So in that sense, it's one of these new zones in the world, which is sort of a failed, it's a ward of the international community, like Gaza is, or like Haiti in a way. It is, in the 19th century, people would immigrate from these areas and go, get on a boat and go to the Americas or Australia or something. But you can't do that today. So the international community just throws money at them and says, don't come into my space, right? Don't eat at my table, but we'll give you enough so you don't starve. But you live in these terrible camps. There's no real solution. And that's becoming, that's the way things are getting frozen in Syria. And it's unclear what the way is out of that.
Now, should the fighting end in Ukraine, you will presumably have a situation that's in at least some ways parallel. I mean, it won't be as complicated as Syria. There won't be as many fragments, but you will have a situation. I mean, assuming, which I think is a safe assumption, that Russia doesn't get driven all the way out of Ukraine in the fullest sense of the term Ukraine, which I just don't see happening without Putin resorting to extremely desperate measures that none of us should welcome. So assuming that, you're going to wind up with a situation where it's kind of a frozen conflict, and there are borders that the international community, I think, is rightly reluctant to recognize, because they would have been created via the illegal use of force by Russia.
The Kissinger option, which is that America is going to need to sit down as a great power with Russia and draw some new borders, in a sense, a zone of influence, and that's that America's saying they won't do that, and they're not going to do it, but that's going to lead to, in some ways, it leads to a similar situation in Syria, where you're supporting an insurgency. Now, of course, it's not the insurgency. You're supporting the legitimate government in Ukraine with more and more firepower. But that means Russia escalates their firepower. And more and more cities are going to be turned to rubble. And this is what happened in Syria. In order to take back Aleppo, the Syrian government had to use barrel bombs and airplanes and tons of artillery. And it devastated the city. The same thing happened in Raqqa and Mosul. In taking it back, those cities back, the Americans used tremendous firepower in order to take them back from ISIS and level the cities. They're not rebuilt today, and they're still in complete rubble. So
the cities they would retake would have already been kind of half reduced to rubble in some cases, since that's the way Russia fights. They're very artillery heavy military. And
it's not just Russia. The American, when we took Raqqa and we took Mosul, we lined up artillery. One of my students is an artillery guy, and he had these giant howitzers, and they could shoot from 30 miles away. And he said we were very, the first few bombs are inaccurate, but we have drones and so forth, and then we can really vector in on house to house. and we just
house to house with 30 miles away with a house. I mean, are the shells themselves precision weapons? They're not, right? I mean,
they're not. They're not big, but it's just micromanaging.
I don't understand the physics of that. But anyway,
well, I'm sure it wasn't as clean as they make it out to be, and it's messy. And if there's a big gust of wind, it blows it off by a bunch of meters, and you end up hitting the wrong house. But that's what's going on. And if you're going to be caught, America didn't want to put boots on the ground. Nobody wants their soldiers to be killed. So you're always going to go to the higher firepower. And that's why we used the atom bomb in Japan. We didn't want to land on Japan and have a bunch of our soldiers killed. So we decided, let's nuke them. And
we were doing that before the nukes. We killed 100,000 people in Tokyo in 48 hours with conventional bombs.
That's true. The night of the black rain in Tokyo, because the whole wooden city just burnt with firebombing. But
which was the goal, to actually literally burn that low-income part of the city down. But I digress.
Right. No, but we're digressing. But the point is important because it's not just Russia that does this. Now, America's developed smart bombs, and we've gotten much more precision, so we can take things out and claim to be more humanitarian. But when we get caught in a bad situation, we do, like anybody, you're going to resort to higher firepower. That's like napalming the jungles of Vietnam, or using Agent Orange. You've got to do what you have to do in order to save your troops, and that's the logic of war, and to win. Right. And Russia is pursuing it because they don't have, they're not as smart as we thought they were, and they've blundered through this, and they're going to resort to the traditional high. And it's going to cause a lot of devastation. So
anyway, but your point is you just get more of the same if and in a way, if the U.S. endlessly backs Ukrainian aspirations to retake all this territory, assuming those aspirations remain intact, and I'm not even sure of that. I'm not sure we've really heard from the Ukrainian people and the mothers of those troops and so on, but if that aspiration remains intact and the U.S. supports it endlessly, you're saying we're going to get more of the same, a lot more carnage, even more destruction, and
that deal is going to have to be cut.
I agree.
A very awkward, unhappy deal is going to have to be cut, where we make some terribly, some very bad decisions. And that's what we did in Afghanistan. You want to make them sooner than later. And the trouble with kicking the can down of the road, like we did in Afghanistan for 20 years, is that you get more and more people who are indebted to you, who've built their lives around trusting you, and their lives are going to be wiped away. So the longer you stay in order to help those people who've already trusted you, the more people you're going to have trusting you and depending on you. And it doesn't solve the problem. Unless you're willing to stay for 80, 90 years, like the British in India or something like that, and just remake the country. But America doesn't have that kind of staying power. We won't do it. And if we now we're giving this heavy artillery and this heavy rocket power to the Ukrainians, who can make a lot of, obviously hurt the Russians very badly with this. But the Russians are going to, I would imagine that they're going to start just lobbing rockets into the middle of Kiev and places like that in order to say, don't do this.
Yeah, I think one disservice that's been done by people who claim that the Russians are already, in effect, pursuing a strategy of just wiping out as many civilians as possible or something, which they're not doing, is that this leaves us under the impression that things can't get worse. They can get a lot worse. If Russia makes it their goal to right now, what it seems to me is happening with the cities in Russia, by and large, there may be cases where Russia says, it would be a little easier if these civilians would evacuate. No need to be too precise with our artillery power. But by and large, what's happening is that when Ukrainian troops defend cities, they are in the cities. They are they're in and around civilian buildings, and it's mainly in trying to kill them that the Russians destroy the cities, right? And it could get a lot worse if Russia actually decides they want to kill civilians and totally wipe out the country of Ukraine.
Yeah, and we saw this in Syria. The longer you're at war, and the more of your family members are killed, and the more frightened you are, the less likely you are to uphold any kind of rules of engagement. And as a soldier, you just want to kill everything that's walking because you don't want to. You're frightened, and that's the trouble. Is that you, whatever little crust of civilization is stopping all these horrible, brutality, falls away, and then very bad things happen.
Yeah, so I would imagine I can't believe that the U.S. really plans to give Ukraine a blank check, even though they're talking that way for, I guess, what they consider political reasons. I just can't believe Biden's real philosophy is whatever the Ukrainians want, it's for them to decide how far they go.
It's hard to know. I mean, a lot of it is rhetoric, I think, now, because the Ukrainians are telling us you've got to stick with a narrative, which is we're going to go all the way because we need to make the Russians blink and we need to make them believe this. And so I think that's where something like a Kissinger writing this op-ed infuriated people, because he's speaking out of church and he should know better than that. So in that sense, but the trouble is you get trapped in your rhetoric, because
Right.
once you convince all the people that this is the moral just thing to do, how do you step back from that?
Right.
And that's the problem.
Right. Biden is putting himself in a political box potentially if he keeps talking the way he's talking. And Zelensky may be doing some of that as well. But in any event, let me ask you just before we go, step back and ask you about your perspective on Ukraine as informed by your study of Syria and Russia's involvement in Syria. Have you been less surprised? I guess there are a couple of things I'd like to know how surprised you were about. The first one would be the way Russia reacted to the deposing in 2014 of a more or less pro-Russian Ukrainian president. Now, they seized Crimea. That was their initial invasion of Ukraine. Crimea, you don't hear this much in America, but Crimea had a very important Russian naval base. And wouldn't surprise me if, given the way the things unfolded in 2014 and the degree of apparent American involvement in the transition of power and so on, Putin wasn't worried that the lease that the long-term lease he had that entitled him to that military base was now imperiled. But in any event, there's also a naval facility in Syria, by the way, that probably figured to some extent in Russia's calculations in intervening there. But anyway. You don't have to get into the naval bases and stuff, but the two questions I want to ask you, and let's focus on the first one first, is first about, were you surprised by how Russia reacted to what happened in 2014, and then I'll ask you a question about the more recent developments in Ukraine.
Well, let me just what struck me the most is that Russia was very successful in supporting Assad and in Syria. And they just used air power. They didn't put boots on the ground. There were some, but very limited. And it didn't cost them lots of money. And they were able to rebuild Assad, which gave them a lot of credibility in the region. Because by the time they stepped in the fall of 2015, most of the region had come to the conclusion that they didn't want Assad to fall, or at least his military, the Syrian military, to collapse, because radicals would take over. And in Syria, and here's the big point, the opposition was never able to unify. There were 1,500 different militias. There was not a military command that was unified. It was a total chaos. And the different militias were fighting each other for turf. It was a mess. And they radicalized. So Putin, I think, looked at this and said, there is really no such thing as Syrian nationalism, and there's no such thing as Ukrainian nationalism. And if I just go boom, and I'm authoritative, they'll scatter. And they're not going to unify. And I think that gave him tremendous confidence in using military force in Ukraine. It was wrong. The Syrian model did not uphold in Ukraine. And Zelensky, shocked everybody. Because here was this government which we knew to be corrupt and laced with pro-Russians and all this stuff. And yet Zelensky stood up and unified Ukrainians in a way that nobody could really imagine. And it clearly undercut everything that Putin foresaw happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the biggest difference, is that nationalism is the wild card. It didn't happen in Syria.
Mm. The
rebel side completely collapsed, and the Western supporters, turned away from them. And in Ukraine, the Ukrainian nationalism really worked. And so that's that for me, that's the big difference between the two. And I think that's where Putin, I think he saw in fighting within Russia that, and he's said lots of countries are not ready for democracy. And the Middle East, and he's accused the United States, when the United States started supporting the insurgency in Syria, he said, the United States doesn't know what they're doing. He gave a big talk at the UN, and he said, I am on the side of sovereignty, and I am on the side, the United States, in saying it wants to bring democracy, is causing havoc, and is ultimately supporting these radical groups like the Islamists in Afghanistan and ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so forth. And that was his speech. And he believed that America's philosophy of supporting democracy is a failure in much of the world. And what the world needs is a strong man like me in Russia. Mm-hmm. Assad, Saddam Hussein, and in Egypt, Gaddafi in Libya. And that was his analysis. And I think he believed that he could do the same thing in Ukraine. The Ukrainians would scatter, he could put in a strong man, and he would get away with it. Because anything the West tried to do would be just sand in their hands and it would fall apart, the way it had in Syria. And that's where the nationalism is really the wild card, I think, that mm-hmm. that separates these two things.
And, he presumably was also over extrapolating from the experience in Crimea, but there the nationalism was on his side. As you said, that's overwhelmingly an ethnically Russian area. And there were real grievances there against Ukrainian control. There had been some tragedy in Odessa, right? Like a bunch of ethnic Russians were in a building and somebody set it on fire and 100 died. That's a big thing in Odessa's oh, wait a second. No, I'm getting mixed up. That's Odessa. That was Odessa, right? That I'm thinking of.
I can't help you here because I don't know enough about the.
Okay. So anyway, but in Crimea, nationalism was more or less on his side, and I don't understand why he assumed it wouldn't be an obstacle once he took on Ukraine more broadly, but apparently he did.
Right. I think he thought it would collapse, and that the Ukrainians wouldn't find what they have found under Zelensky, which is some kind of unity and real fighting spirit.
Yeah.
And I think all of Europe was astonished, and then they jumped in behind, and it's been galvanizing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to say? I mean, you've really helped illuminate this the dynamics of this, this somewhat complicated thing involving Turkey and Sweden, Finland,
well,
Syria.
I just come back and end by saying that the Middle East, I think a lot of this conflict is about nation building. And it begins in World War I with the collapse of these multi-ethnic empires and an attempt to recreate political community around a national identity. And as you said in the beginning, so many of these borders were drawn around peoples who didn't want to live together and couldn't ultimately find a convivienda, a common political community. And so they're fighting it out, and it's long and bloody. And in a place like Syria, where you haven't had a resolution to this in any meaningful way, where the regime has remained in power, but much of the population doesn't see it as legitimate, it means that conflict is not over, and it's been frozen. And we see that in Lebanon, we see that in Iraq, we see that in Syria. It isn't over. We see that in Arab-Israeli conflict too, in Israel/Palestine, if you will. this whole region is fighting over national borders. And today, it's caught up in this great power conflict: Russia versus America, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, Shiite versus Sunni. And unfortunately, with the power of sanctions, it makes recovering from this kind of war much, much more difficult, because the crushing sanctions that are on places like Syria or Iran, but Syria in particular, which mean that people are living in terrible poverty. It's very difficult to rebuild. And it's economic growth ultimately that can help you rebuild some kind of trust amongst people who've been fighting in a civil war.
And these are largely our doing. The sanctions are, if the U.S. wanted a different policy with respect to Syria and Iran, there could be the sanctions could be, if not entirely removed, much less.
Sanctions are a modern form of warfare. They've always been there because people have tried to put ships around Europe, and that's what Britain did with Napoleon and so forth. But it was very difficult to maintain what we do today with SWIFT codes and banking and freezing out and designating people and so forth. And so sanctions really work today. And in many ways, you think of the Treasury Department, which has hundreds of people in it today. It's beginning to compete with the State Department for making foreign policy, as well as with the Defense Department, of course, because the military budget is the biggest. But the Treasury Department is becoming a very fundamental part of our foreign policy making. And the State Department becomes, in a sense, relatively less and less important. And that growth within the Treasury Department indicates how important this economic warfare is.
So this gives Treasury actual influence over foreign policy. In other words, I would imagine that what happens is, Tony Blinken and Biden work things out, decide what they want to do, and send a memo to Treasury. But it sounds like you're suggesting that there's some actual influence within Treasury.
Yes. Well, once people fight to get into the jobs, and you have lobby groups getting people into jobs, and once you get a whole line of people who are going to be designated, if you want to carry out diplomacy, and we see this with the IRGC, right? One of the biggest stumbling blocks. The
Iranian Revolutionary Guard, a branch of the military.
Right. The biggest stumbling block today in front of coming to some kind of accord with Iran over the nuclear deal is that the Treasury Department, the American government, has designated the IRGC, that's the Republican Guard, as a terrorist organization. And the government of Iran is saying, no, you have to lift that designation. And politically, it's too hard to do it.
Right. But Biden could do it. He's the one who senses the political pressure, right?
Right. But in many ways, it was placed on there by Trump.
Right.
In order to make it impossible for him to come to an agreement. And so these were, sort of poison pills that were dropped by the last administration. So it becomes very political. It becomes hard to undo, and it becomes hard to coordinate all these different groups, which are all fighting for authority over foreign policy.
And I think it can be the case. I mean, I've heard of things like this happening that, somebody in the State Department really has doubts about sanctions. They talk to Treasury, and people in Treasury say, no, you don't understand. Legally, it's just very hard to do. I mean, there definitely can be that kind of resistance, that level of influence.
Yeah. No, it is hard because the sanctions get passed by Congress as well. And then it becomes very hard because they have in their language is that the regime has to stop killing people, things like that. Yeah. And, so how do you ever lift that? It becomes very difficult. It becomes hard to do it through diplomacy and making deals because the Congress will say, no, they're still killing people and they're a bad regime, which is true. And then,
of course, our sanctions are killing people too, but that's not.
Yes, they are. And that's something that we don't really, it's the secret killer, it's sort of like high blood pressure. You don't notice it and it just gets you. Yeah. And that's where sanctions are so devastating. And of course they hurt the weakest people in society who've got the least amount of food, the children, the women, and so forth. And they're the ones who are really hurt by sanctions. It's not Assad and his minions around him in his palace who are eating just fine.
And there are other countries, Venezuela and so on. Well, thanks so much, Josh. Where can people find you online? Now, what's your Twitter? Is your Twitter handle Joshua Landis? Or
it's Joshua_Landis.
Landis. And
Landis.
And is there any other work?
Well, I write Syria comment right now. It's got a little bit of technical problems, but that's another place. It's a blog called Syria Comment.
So normally, if people Google that, it's up and running, but it may not be at this moment. Is that it?
Right. It's going to be fixed this next week. But the Twitter, I'm very active on Twitter. Joshua Landis. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm at Robert Writer. And speaking of self-promotion, I encourage people to rate and review us and rate and review The Wright Show and so on. But thanks so much, Josh. This has been very illuminating. I hope we'll talk down the road.
All right.